Gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Ian Turner. Ian's asked me not to wax lyrically about what he's done in the past, but for those of you who have been working in and around this area know just how much Ian's contributed to the area of game-based learning and gamification of learning within higher education. So that's my very brief introduction there. But Ian is a professor at Derby, and I'm going to hand over to him. If that's all right, Ian. Hope
Yep.
that wasn't too much of waxing lyrically.
No, thanks, Stephen. There's too much pomp and pageantry in higher education. Could do without it on a Friday afternoon. I'm sure you could. So thanks for the invite. Well, when I was thinking about what do I want to talk about here, there was, I guess, 100 different things I could have talked about. But because I've met Stephen recently in a Dungeons and Dragons based event, I thought I'd talk about role-playing games in higher education, particularly. So apologies to Stephen that you might have heard a few of these notes before, but we'll talk about a couple of projects I've been involved in with role-playing games, but really want to finish off with a kind of prospective slide to see what everybody else is doing, because I really think this is a massive untapped area. My evidence for that is the peer-reviewed literature, if we can judge that as a quality, around the use of role-playing games in the higher education setting, and I'll outline my cause as we go through. So I'm not one for ceremony, so if you want to talk to me as we're going through, feel free to interrupt. That's not a problem at all. Okay, so when you've got a group of people who are interested in games, the slide where you talk about what games are is always a bit of a risque kind of move, but I do have a slide on what are tabletop role-playing games. You never know, people may be playing other types of games and not role-playing games. I mean, but for those of you who do know about it, I want you to think about some of the core principles of role-playing games and how they map into classic pedagogies that have been prevalent in higher education for years and still persist, because that's where the heart of where this comes. And certainly I'm sure you've been in a conversation, if you do game stuff, where you've had to convince someone that doing Dungeons and Dragons type adventures in your level 7 academic class is a valid pedagogic concept. So role-playing games are effectively, I like to describe them as collective storytelling games. Of course, there's like anything in life, crisp flavors, types of cars, there's loads of different variations that do slightly different things, but they're effectively collective storytelling games. And in the very classic idea, the story exists solely in the minds of those people playing it. So through the art of description and narration, people are telling each other what they're doing. And, you know, the level of imagination never ceases to amaze me, particularly when you see games involving young players, how they can not only imagine entire worlds, but towns within those worlds, what happens in those towns, what's on the menus on those taverns in those towns, and hundreds of people who live in their worlds and their motivations, their alliances, and those kind of things is quite an impressive thing. And when you talk about things like creativity and innovation as some key tools in any academic profession across higher education, you know, you can see immediately why I'm attracted to role-playing games. They tend to be narrative driven, often in role-playing games. One person takes the lead as chief storyteller, sometimes called the games master or dungeon master. I'm obviously focusing on Dungeons and Dragons, but everyone else drives it. Most role-playing games that I've played do involve an element of chance, usually through the roll of a dice or a pack of cards, drawing, or some tables, which adds that element of unexpected to it. Despite the kind of tropes that pervade in the literature, it's not all about, you know, my +2 battle axe and slaying orcs. You know, they can be very characterful and very non-combat driven role-playing games. So I think I've probably said enough about role-playing games as a concept and idea, and I'll say a little bit more about why I think they're particularly important in a minute. But let's get to the crux, which is the research. So I've become interested in role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons for, I don't know, very recently, I suppose, probably only about 3.5 years that I've been doing game-based learning, board games, for much longer. And I began by sort of starting to collect, I think, pretty much every published article that talks specifically about Dungeons and Dragons in any context. The list is about 60 or 70 kind of academic sources long, and you could broadly look these into 3 categories. So work that talks about mental health, and the literature there is really divided into 2 pools. One pool, clinical studies, so using it as a therapeutic intervention, and one in a non-clinical setting, obviously, and more about connectiveness and social adhesion and those kind of things. The second tranche of literature is all about social development, as using it overtly as an inclusion strategy, or measuring it indirectly as it empowers certain demographics or small groups of communities. And the third tranche of literature is very much around using it overtly as a pedagogic tool. If you read pedagogic literature like I have to, and like to, I guess, you see that it really does span from the kind of theoretical, conceptual, all the way down to the practice-based stuff. And this is definitely the practice-based kind of stuff. So I've made a role-playing game for topic X in discipline X, and here's my evaluation of it. So there's a fair few examples of that. So I did that, and about this time, you can tell from the news headlines, the pandemic was well underway, and I kept seeing these kind of popular news press type articles pop up. COVID-19, Dungeons and Dragons got us through lockdown, etc., etc. And I started to probe more into the literature, and I found the literature wanting, though there are some good studies in there. There's far too many of them are based on very, very small sample numbers. Sometimes just one gaming group of 4 or 5 people, over a long period of time. So very isolated case studies, and making pretty grandiose kind of claims about it. And on the other end, there were some slightly more robust studies, but I felt like they've really lost the essence of what Dungeons and Dragons was actually about by trying to make it more applicable to a wider audience. So I started my own journey on research. Just to note, there are a couple of good books on Dungeons and Dragons, and there's a new one coming out soon, Dungeons and Dragons Studies, but run by an Australian group who I'm in contact with, and feature on my reference list quite heavily. So my first kind of foray into Dungeons and Dragons research was really around COVID-19, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who went from being my social life involved about being outside and doing stuff outside. My break from my family was playing games, to suddenly realizing I can't do that anymore. So I dived into platforms like Roll20 to have a go at some online gaming. In fact, in the end, I resorted to a classic Zoom with a group of friends, which worked just as well. I started playing role-playing games online, and despite the kind of image of a geek my children wished to present of me, I wasn't the only one. In fact, thousands and thousands of people were doing the same. Now, I think it's important here just to say a word about the popularity of role-playing games. Now, for me, this is really important in terms of how we embed it or use it within our curricula. Its general acceptance as an approach really does lay the foundations for how you can apply it in the classroom, and to what level, how much you can apply it in the classroom. So, I mean, these numbers are always really hard to kind of work out, but they do estimate there's around 50 million people in the world who've played Dungeons and Dragons, which sounds like a large number. Quite importantly, during the pandemic, the revenue rose 24% for Wizards of the Coast, and recently, the last year's sales that I've got the data for, it rose 33% on that 24%. So a net worth of £816 million. So if you know the history in Dungeons and Dragons, which I'm sure some of you do, when they nearly went bust, this is an incredible turnaround. Dungeons and Dragons Beyond, the platform that supports the game, saw a doubling of subscribers, between 2019 and 2020. Now, people always point to popular cultural icons that kind of help influence these kind of things, and I'm absolutely certain, Stranger Things, Big Bang Theory, critical role, etc., have had a pronounced influence in many people's, increase in the idea of Dungeons and Dragons. I also think that Wizard of the Coast have done a lot of work to tidy up their ship. The idea of a bikini-clad princess in a, or a barbarian wearing a chainmail thong waving a battle axe is long gone from their kind of artwork, and they're much more inclusive in the way that they introduce, different characters, characters that have disabilities, etc., ways to play the game in a safe space, etc. Haven't done all the work they needed to do, and there's a lot of literature on there. I was waiting for somebody to mention the OGL debacle, which has certainly tarnished their reputation somewhat. But I mean, if you read pieces, that does tend to mostly be from the hardcore players who were there pre the uprising that I've just talked about. So why have I told you what you already know about role-playing games? I think it's really important because it helps us embed these tools. I think the final thing to say is though it's really hard to work out, the demographic of a dungeon player has changed massively. In that 50, in a survey that they did, they don't disclose the full demographics, but they did say that 42% of their players identify as female. And if you go back to the 1980s and the stereotypical image of a middle-aged bearded man, who playing Dungeons and Dragons, it's good to see that there is some diversity in player types. If you go to any of the big gaming shows, you do see that diversity represented in front of you. So our first paper was about role-playing games and mental health. So it's really just a bit of a literature review and framing, really. And like a lot of people, when this topic gets brought up in newspaper articles and stuff, our early reference points were around the potential negative impacts on role-playing games on mental health. And there's some papers that have talked about, the links between Dungeons and Dragons and psychopathology, Dungeons and Dragons depression, Dungeons and Dragons and juvenile delinquency, Dungeons and Dragons in, more likely to engage with harmful behaviors like, drug abuse and alcohol abuse. And though some of these papers do persist, they've been widely debunked. There's been no studies that provide any kind of firm association between any of those just things I've listed, which I probably didn't need to tell you. But I mean, the idea, Dungeons and Dragons history and some of those famous cases, the missing boy in the sewers, etc., the whole kind of demonology and witchcraft angle of Dungeons and Dragons does persist, particularly in popular news stories about it. Following on from that, we talked quite a bit about the use of role-playing games in the non-clinical setting. So we didn't want to focus on how role-playing games can be used clinically. I'm not a clinician, but we thought that there will be a lot of benefits for role-playing games, in terms of our own well-being. And we can use our own anecdotal experiences in that regard. I mean, why do we play these games? And a couple of key studies really do reference this. So, Adams makes a very good point around how our real world needs for connection, our real world needs for release can actually be met through a symbolic in-game interaction. Essentially, what is he saying? That you can explore the things that are troubling you in your real world encounter through the fictional character and the fictional world you create, and that actually leads to some resolution, some coping skills which you can apply in the real world. And he talks a lot about abstraction there rather than directly, role playing that difficult DPR conversation where you have with your boss at work, obviously, but, in terms of things like conflict resolution. Sargent talks a lot about that there's evidence that, in a non-clinical setting, role-playing games can do things like help reduce social anxiety. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon. If you do any game-based research, one real thing about games is that you're not talking about yourself, you're not looking anybody in the eye, you're talking about fictional things. And when you're taking one step away from reality, it's much easier to talk about. mean, this is really widely applied in the clinical setting. You know, when they're doing treatments with, one of my collaborators is a clinician in Derbyshire hospitals, and they frequently do things like play PlayStation games with their patients as part of their clinical treatment, because when they're playing the game and watching FIFA on the screen, then the conversation can stray into the things they really should be talking about, but a face-to-face, eyeball-to-eyeball conversation just doesn't generate that. There's also some work on how it can help with past trauma. There's some caution to be offered with the papers that talk about this, and perhaps we get into discussion about that afterwards. There's even suggestions it can improve, real world social skills by, the difficult conversations you have to have in the game and how you develop relationships within the game. Unless you've got that bloodthirsty player that wants to kill or thief everything, I suppose. Kusel and Quinlan talked about relationship development and skill development, and a safe place to engage in mental health difficulties. They also talk about a place to explore different identities. If you go back to the 1980s game, you could play a gender that you don't identify with. Obviously, you have religious and moral compasses within the game, which may not match your own. And as the game's expanded and we have different races, and the ability to have characters that, have mental and physical disabilities as part of the game, a place to explore different identities within a safe gaming environment. Once again, I think a slice of caution needs to be offered with those. Sense that it can increase empathy, particularly if you force players to take particular debates or points of view in how they work. And then there's a whole host of anecdotal stuff, sports and mental health of children and adults, how autistic individuals interact with other. These are papers I'm talking about, but they're often the ones that I highlighted earlier on, which have got very small sample sizes. So we really wrote a position paper, which I'll share at the end if anybody would like to read it. It's only about 5 or 6 sides, and it got quite a big reaction in terms of people reaching out to us. Yeah, when it's pretty much hashtag geeks are everywhere, and people from all over the country, including like clinical lead for Birmingham City Hospitals, etc. Well, yes, come on, let's talk more about this. And you may have seen that we hosted the Dungeons and Dragons in Higher Education research event following that. So it was a position paper, and my last slide, in a few minutes' time, will highlight what we're going to do with this next, and I guess open an invitation to anybody who's interested in working with us. Meanwhile, in another town, another venture, split party, etc. I was particularly interested in skills development. My role at the university is in central services, though I still teach in my discipline, which is biosciences. And I became interested in the idea of skill development. So skill development at universities, in case you don't work at one, is incredibly important, talked about a lot. And we measure our skill development in many ways, but also through the through
here, right? Yeah.
Good. Sorry, interruption. We also through things like the graduate outcomes study, and skill development is obviously embedded in the curriculum taught by academics, but also it's often run by external agencies like the Career Development Service, and they've wrestled for years and years whether or not they do this in curricular, so you do it as part of your talk modules, extracurricular, go along if you want to, or co-curricular, kind of hybrid model of the two. So I started collecting all the Dungeons and Dragons papers, or more general tabletop role-playing papers that talked about skill development. And here's just a smattering of some of the papers that tried to measure one or other of the many kind of skills that employers say they want in our students. Yeah, I mean, you've all been there when you said, oh, our employers really want these skills. It's become such a cliche in higher education when you say those kind of things. But, the big surveys that you see do actually back up these kind of status. And so, and certainly in my case, do our professional societies and regulatory bodies. So with my colleague, Dr. Louise Robinson, we decided we're going to create a Dungeons and Dragons adventure that develops employability skills. So I'll take you through the adventure now. So the first time we did this, we did it physically. We did it with a small number of players. There were six players. The players had no experience at all in tabletop role-playing games that they disclosed to us. They did know that they were doing a game-based employability exercise, but not much beyond that. We decided that we were going to go straight into the game. We'll talk about more about it afterwards, but over the years, we've been doing game-based learning activities. I've found it's vitally important that the pre or post-game experience is in helping consolidate and helping understand what the hell they've just done. But we decided in this case, we're going to launch straight in. And we began by asking them to make a character sheet. And there's just an extract of the character sheet here. And you'll notice from the words on the screen that these are not the normal D&D character sheet. And we mapped them into some employability skills that seem to be common across many areas. So we did this in a semi D&D way by using dice and allow them to put the dice in the various boxes they want. And they're making it about themselves, which ones they thought they were best at, which ones they thought they were worst at. We decided after a bit of playing around that we weren't going to make them barbarians and elves. We're going to let them be themselves, so put their own name on it. We were worried about that step into fantasy being one step too far too quickly for people who never played tabletop role-playing games. There's a lot more I could say about the development. I mean, I don't know about how everyone else feels, but when making a game, I spend a lot of time road testing the ideas and battering them back and forth before I put it in front of a student. And every decision, even the small ones, you know, have been well thought out to help make a good game experience. So after they made their character sheet, they kind of, you know, talked a little bit with each other. They've handled the dice. We then launch into the game itself. So we decided to use map tiles, which we custom created because we wanted to have a physical focus. We worried about abstraction of the ideas we're talking about. Could be one step too far for those new players. And we also got some little minis that they could use to represent themselves on the map. So we came up with a story. And the story in essence was that I forget the full narrative, and when I go in D&D mode, obviously I do the voice like everybody else, but amongst friends, essentially they're doing a study group in the library late at night. They've got an exam coming, when one by one they all slowly doze off at the table, and they wake up in the room that you can see on the screen here. So we obviously describe the room to them and start with the D&D adventure. Now, having done this adventure now quite a few times, there's a clear arc where in the early parts of the adventure, I'm doing very much almost a choose your own adventure type narration. What would you like to do? Would you like to do this? But very quickly, you can start to withdraw that and be more comfortable with the silences as the players start to take the action themselves. So the adventure we designed is essentially a glorified escape room, I suppose, and each room area's got a small puzzle in it, and they need to solve that puzzle to get out of the room. So in this particular puzzle, there's 4 stone plinths with a black circle marble, a cylinder on the top, and a wooden handle. And in the first version we designed, they need to pull these handles in a certain order, and if they do, the door opens. Pure and simple. We refined it a lot. We designed the puzzles so that there was lots of outs. So if you've got the procrastinating group who take forever, instead of having to pull the handles in the right order, it could be they just need to pull all 4 handles simultaneously. Or if they're really struggling, they just need to pull the right handle. But, you know, like all good DMs, you adapt the adventure to the time it's taking in the room to get them going on. So the way this is linked to employability skills is I DM and my colleague Louise listens, though in later versions I did both things myself. And any time that somebody says something that is linked to one of the employability skills, like they come up with a creative solution about how we could do it, perhaps we could all tie our belts to the levers and, you know, pull them down, whatever. I give them a plastic coin. I've got some of those plastic pirate coins, so just slide it across the table. Don't say anything about it, just slide them across. So people very quickly start to amass these coins. And we go through the adventure. Now, one thing that we built in early on, which was a very, very useful idea, was the idea of Itch the Imp. So Itch the Imp is a non-player character, and Itch the Imp basically appears in a cloud of sulphurous smoke every now and again if the players get stuck or not doing what they should be doing. I don't want them to spend the hour there with me stuck in the first room postulating on levers. So Itch the Imp appears and gives them basically a hint and then disappears. They can't call Itch, though they do try sometimes. Itch appears when he wants to, and he's a mischievous little imp. And it is really quite a useful structural narrative hook in order to get people working. So they go through the adventure. There's these are the tiles we actually use in the room, printed out on A3 sheets. This one is there's some hidden. They have to observe the coffin in the right way, and there's some directions, and they have to do some logic processing to work on the tiles in a secret order in order to get out. This one has a gargoyle on it, and the gargoyle will open the door for them. They have to speak to him in the right way, and if they ever go wrong, the gargoyle resets and starts the conversation again. It's all about diplomacy and those kind of things. Yeah, it doesn't respond to threats and those kind of things. Each of the corridors have got small little exercises in them in the well. We also put the corridors in as another structural narrative hook. I mean, you've all been in group-based activities with students where you've got the confident student who dominates the conversation. I mean, I made this up on the day the first time we played it. We started playing and somebody was just taking over. So as they walked down the first corridor, I rolled a dice and said, unfortunately, your character walks into a big, thick, sticky cobweb, and hear the dice clank. And for the next 6 minutes, you can't talk, and started the timer. So basically, that shut them up for 6 minutes and gave somebody else the chance to speak. So use lots of little narrative hooks like that just to make sure everybody else had the chance. If you got a very quiet player in some of the rooms where the observation stuff, you make sure that the incredibly quiet player is the one that spots the thing, and then because they've got to then tell the other players what they've just spotted. It brings them into the game. So it worked quite well. I think in the end we had 4 rooms and 4 corridors. I don't think we ever got through them all, but when you're using modular tile systems, you can quickly flick one out and bring another one in. So easy peasy as it goes. So you may be thinking, what's this got to do with employability? Though it sounds quite fun. It's back to this character sheet in a way. So the character sheet, which has all these skills on and the coins, you'll see from this small extract of the table that I've got at the bottom, each of the room is linked to specific employability skills. When I say linked, I mean that is tenuous. I mean, it really depends what the players come up with, but we've designed the puzzles and the narrative to try and tease out some different skills, and we're obviously making a note with these. And where the students come to the realization effect is at the end of the adventure. So when we're getting close to the end, they suddenly come through to this area, which you can see on the screen with the grass, and they can see a wall. Now that wall changed as we did a few versions of this to be like a translucent wall where they could see themselves sleeping back in the library. So basically a turn to their real lives. And as they excuse me, as they get to the wall, a spectral figure appears and essentially tells them he can only let a few of them through, and they have to convince themselves that convince him that they're allowed through the wall. And that's when Itch the Imp appears, stops time effectively, and tells the players they're gonna have to convince the demon while he's worthy why they have the skills necessary. So at this point they can use the coins they've got to up their scores, and they effectively specify an elevator type pitch to convince this spectral demon why they can be let through. So it's making them realize that the skills that they've already got and the skills they've developed in the game allows them to come through. So we do that. So sometimes people don't want to do that. You can build that into the narrative. you know, if you need to, but most cases people are happy to do a short pitch to the demon or fall on the demon's sword, metaphorically anyway. Then we let them through. And then the close, of course, the most important part is the link between skill acquisition, which is what the early game attributes are, and skill presentation. And obviously a degree is also about skill acquisition. And you know, ultimately you've got to present yourself in a CV or an interview or a pitch. So that's the, some might say, tenuous link to employability skills. And of course, post-session, the framing is absolutely hooked back into our career employability service, into the one-to-one coaching dialogues that they have. So that's the outro for the game, which is as important as the game itself. We made these kind of guides, these kind of things with like scenarios and those kind of things to give hints for people, which, you know, if anybody wants it, I've got it all saved somewhere so other people can play it. So how's it gone? I mean, the obligatory quotes, I suppose, in a way. People always stick up quotes, cherry pick a few quotes. So I did this, we've done this game a few times on a small group. So small groups, we all know the limitations, etc. In the so before the COVID pandemic, we did this at a conference we had a room about 50 people, and in that game we adapted it. We made a dungeon master kind of sheet. One person agreed to be the dungeon master, and in the environment we're in almost every group there's somebody who is confident enough to be a storyteller or played a game before who's happy to read out the script. So they acted as us, and then we were floaters then. And that actually worked really, really well. It gives me confidence it could be applied in a classroom setting. What was interesting was the multiple interpretations people have had about what went on. In the COVID pandemic, towards the back end of it, I was asked to do this, moving after that, but I was asked to do it remotely to a group in Exeter originally, and 25 people turned up. So I kept the same idea, except for this time, the people who fall asleep, they all fall asleep in the library, but only 5 of them are, in the dungeon. The rest of them are basically looking down upon the dungeon, basically looking at the map they can see on the screen. They shout, they scream, but they can't be heard. But they do find out that the team's WhatsApp group is working, which represents the chat along the side of the Teams thing. So they could type advice and ideas along the side. And then every room we flipped the players that went in. First time it was messy, but second time I tried that approach, it worked okay actually. I got a bit better understanding how it would work, and needed to up the complexity of the puzzles as well in order to do it. So we've written that up. The journal it's gone into innovative practice in higher education is, very, very low impact factor. I mean, quite frankly, I couldn't care less. It's just sharing a new idea, a new approach. But I do think there's a lot of potential for games, full stop, of course, but particularly role-playing games in terms of skill development. So I'm going to do one more slide, then I want to stop because I would like to have a good old conversation with you for the remaining 20 minutes, and just talk about some of the applications of research. So I won't read them all out, but we've got quite a few projects going on in the non-clinical setting now. That initial postulated paper has manifested into an actual study of D&D players. We've also got somebody who's exploring its therapeutic use, working with, I think the technical term is runaway delinquents, but people who have left home, who are still minors, and counselling, so using D&D there. We're also interested in some of the aspects around neurodiversity in games, and there's quite a lot of research around this, as well as identity and expression of identity. I guess personally, so that's with my psychology colleagues, I'm particularly interested in its role, in this skill-based development, and its focus in disciplinary contexts, for teaching things like probability and stats, or ethical dilemmas. Not hard to see the relationships between those two there. So that's kind of the end of the formal bit I was going to talk about. I'm hopeful now that people want to talk about D&D and its impact.